Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Conversation Series with Women of Substance. Pujita,
Yeah,
I introduced you as an Indian classical dancer whose expertise is in Vilasni Natyam and Kuchipudi. But my first
yeah.
question to you is how did this journey of dance begin in the first place? And then how did it um, uh, uh, move into Indian classical dancing and Vilasni Natyam and Kuchipudi in particular? Could you just tell us a little bit about this journey?
Yes. So I've had a fairly what would one would call a slightly unconventional upbringing because of the for armed forces background. So we lived like gypsies for the better part of my childhood. And so even though my mom would try and find a teacher in every station that we went to, it wasn't as if I had like a continual training in any form.
Yeah.
I was always interested in dance because my mom has always been very, very inclined to the arts, like all kinds of arts, especially music and dance. So I remember that even as little kids, in my time, Doordarshan used to air, and even now they have a national, classical dance and music broadcast. But we used to religiously watch that when we were kids. Every Sunday night, I think, national program of music and classical music and dance. So, I remember watching that, growing up watching that, and all the stars of the Indian classical world, be it musicians or dancers. I remember watching them when I was a little girl. So
Yeah.
it kind of, I think, it started. The trigger was there. The stimuli were what I received was in my early years, and it had always stayed with me. Except that I never found the time or the space to train. And of
Okay.
course, when we moved to the south post my father's retirement, I kind of did a whole bunch of a little bit of this, little bit of that. Started with
Hmm.
Bharatnatyam. I remember even going to Ananda Akka for Bharatnatyam for a bit.
Wow. Okay.
But I think, as I mentioned in a conversation a while ago, that there were a couple of triggers that really spurred me on to take it up in a serious way. Um, I was never considered in my family, like between my sister and I. My mom always thought that I had a better voice, and so she always assumed that I would take on music more seriously. And I
Okay.
did. I mean, both of us trained in classical music for several years, and so that was, she thought that my sister would be the dancer and I would be the singer. But, and I always assumed that she was a better dancer, not me. But so here's the thing, we used to have these dance parties at the RSI, which is an armed forces club, every last Saturday of the month. And I kind of discovered my flair for dancing on the dance floor quite
Ah,
strangely.
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I found that, and this was in my late teen years when I was about 17, 16, 17, 18,
Okay.
19. And I kind of, I discovered that I love dancing. I love, responding to music instinctively. But then I also realized that this is not something that I can live with for them. It's all very well when you're young, you're dancing on the floor. But, you know, if you want dance to be a big part of your life, then you need to do something that is more formalized. So things like that, there were certain incidents like I had mentioned some time back. I read a book called, Time Pass, which is the autobiography of Pratima Bedi, which influenced me greatly because she also comes from a very, very unconventional background and unlikely world of glamour and, films and things like that. Um, and then she took to classical dance very late in life after she had two kids. So, things like that kind of made me, I realized that, even I could take up dance. I wasn't, in fact, I was only about 20. And that's it. That's how it started. I wanted to go to Nityagram. It didn't work out for different reasons. I went to Delhi. I stayed in Sri Ram Bharatiya Kala Kendra learning Kathak for a while, just after my college. And that also didn't work. So I've had a pretty, I've jumped around quite a bit, hop, skip, and jump. But anyway, long story short, I did a couple of things, and then finally, I came back to Hyderabad. I was in Bangalore for a while. I was working for an NGO over there, and
Okay.
while I was in Bangalore, I learned some Odissi as well.
Ah,
Um, so, but then finally, I came back to when I got married in 2003. I came back to Hyderabad and and met Anupama Kailash, our guru,
Yes.
and then continued from there, and I haven't looked back ever since.
Right, right. That's quite the journey, Pujita. And then you ended up getting into Kuchipudi and then Vilasini Natyam, and there was no stopping you post that, I think. And yeah. What
Yeah.
do you love about Kuchipudi and what do you love about Vilasini Natyam that kept you going?
Kuchipudi, I think. So I'll tell you a story. When I was in Delhi, I was in Shriram Bharati Kala Kendra. By the way, am I audible? My visual may not be
clear. I can hear everything you're saying. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So while I was in Delhi, I was in the hostel. I was in Shriram Bharati Kala Kendra. I wasn't enjoying my sojourn there very much. So I was enrolled for the Kathak program. And for various reasons, it was not the happiest time of my life because it wasn't what I envisaged it would be, you know. And I don't want to get into the reasons, but whatever. It was not a very happy time. I wasn't happy with the program. I wasn't happy with the place. So I don't know, I was questing, I guess. And I remember I happened to go to a temple. I think this was very close to the AP Bhavan, you know, Andhra Pradesh Bhavan in Delhi. This is in South Delhi. And I remember going there and I heard the strains of Kuchipudi Sollukattu coming from AP Bhavan, some room, some hall in AP Bhavan while I was walking past the building. Okay. I stopped. Now, and I was in Delhi. Remember, I was homesick. I missed home. I missed, although I was in armed forces. I was a Fauji kid. So Hindi was not a problem, and I was so homesick and I was so, craving for sights and sounds and smells of home that it immediately drew me. And I found myself looking for wherever the sounds were emanating from. And I walked into the hall and I saw this really thriving class that was in progress with like a large number of students and all basically, Telugu kids, being raised in Delhi. So there was this gentleman called Pasumarthi Vittal who comes from the Pasumarthi family. He was one of the few people who were teaching Kuchipudi in those days. This was in 99. So I went in and I said, look, I'm enrolled at Shriram Bharati Kala Kendra. I'm learning Kathak over there, but I want to. And I had already trained in Bharatnatyam a little bit, so it wasn't as if a South Indian form was new to me. So I said, I want to do Kuchipudi. So he said, but how will you manage the two? I said, don't worry, I'll figure it out. So I used to attend classes in Shriram Bharati Kala Kendra, and I think weekends I would go take a bus, go to AP Bhavan and take those classes over there. So I kind of very rapidly, it came to me, I have to say, it came to me very easily and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Because, and that's when I realized, because by now I had done some Kathak, I had done Bharatnatyam, and now I was doing Kuchipudi. I just felt that maybe there is something to do with the genes, genetics, culture, roots, because I felt that I responded to it instantly, the sounds, and there is such a bounce and vigor to Kuchipudi as opposed to other forms, right? It's a much more dynamic form. It's fast-paced. So I responded to all of it. And so Sollukattu is also very unique. It's not like it's different from Bharatnatyam. So I enjoyed it, and I paced through the class very quickly. And so that's how it started. And of course, then my mother, on one of our phone conversations, said, "Look, you don't have to go to Delhi, all the way to Delhi to learn Kuchipudi. Pack your bags and come back home." So I came. So that's how Kuchipudi happened. And of course, you know the rest. I have been with Anu Akka, and I was also for a bit with Ramadevi Garu when I came back, also with Vedantam Ramalinga Shastri Garu. And then I came to Anupama. So that is Kuchipudi. And of course, I was, you remember you started with Akka, Anu, Akka for you. And we did programs and performances together. And at one point, I think it was 2000, 4 or 5, if you remember, Anu had started her training in Vilasini Natyam, and we were introduced to it. Yeah,
Yes.
and I remember going to the initial years, 2004 or so, going to the temple, the Ranganatha Swami temple, and watching Apurva and Anu and Akka. So I guess, it just felt like a natural progression, natural step in a natural progression, because because Kuchipudi would represent the male Telugu tradition, because the underpinnings are male theatrical tradition, and then Vilasini Natyam represented the feminine. So it would have balanced I think it kind of balances my chi, yin yang, both the male and the female components of our being.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so Vilasini Natyam is a more sustained, graceful, expressive, very subtle. It has its own beauty. So yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and Pujita, you trained under Padma Bhushan Swapna Sundari Garu. How was that experience, and how did that influence you, not just as a dancer but as a person?
Yes. Akka is an amazing. To begin with, she doesn't need my endorsement, but she is a genius of an artist. We were in awe of her. I don't think we were in her, not even in her orbit. So, we would place ourselves right at the periphery of the class and only spoke when we were spoken to, which was rare. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. And so it was initially, we were very much in awe of her. And all our communication used to happen via Anu. So if you wanted to say something to her, or, say, Anu, can you tell her this? Or Anu, so it was never direct. And if it was direct, it was always with a great deal of trepidation. I'm not a sort of person who is usually in awe of people, but she is somebody who I have been in awe of for a very, very long time. But of course, over the years, it changed, because then, we saw a fun side to her also. Like whenever we would go to Delhi or on programs, we saw a very, very, a very childlike almost side of her, which was very endearing. Never knew that existed. And her thing was that whenever we traveled, she would, she would sort of become this fun person. She would take us shopping, and, and she's a great shopper. So, she'll say, you should buy this. This will totally go with, this will totally go on you. You look good in this. And of course, when it was back to Hyderabad, back in the, rehearsals, and again, she would don the role of the guru. So, and also a woman of mercurial temper, and, somebody who, I guess it's only to be expected from a person of that stature. I don't really hold that against her. But yes, somebody I've always been greatly in awe of, to put it mildly. But when she started training me, I saw the other side of her, which is that of a guru, a mentor. She's a very sharp person. Obviously, you can't reach that stage in life without having that ability to spot the minutest of mistakes and flaws, and So whenever I was my experience was a little that I didn't stay with her for a long, unfortunately, because she moved back. Her visits to Hyderabad became less frequent. But whatever time I did spend under her guidance, I could tell that she's such a sharp woman. The littlest things would stand out. Like she would tell me the littlest things where I was doing wrong. Just tweaking the littlest, the minutest details, which would have, I think, passed the observation of any ordinary person. So I think that is something that I saw. And so, yeah, amazing person, amazing personality. And I have never really come out of my awe of her. Still remain humbly in awe.
You're so lucky, Pujita, to have been able to interact with ma'am and learn from her. What a blessing.
Yes. Yes.
Pujita,
definitely.
As a professional dancer, you have performed in a number of prestigious dance festivals in India. you've also performed
Yes.
abroad, like in Sydney and
Yes.
I think Australia
Yes.
and the Netherlands as well. So my
Hey.
question
Yes.
to you
Yes.
is, as an artist, as a performing artist, what was your experience performing in India and
Mm-hmm.
abroad? And how was your interaction with different types of audiences in India as well as abroad? Can you tell us something about that experience?
Yes. Um, of course, I haven't. I mean, I have performed abroad, but my experience is not as vast as some of the more seasoned dancers. But whatever little I have done, I can say that every audience is different, Amy. So even in India, you find that you could be performing in a very small space with just about 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 individuals, and they would all be positively engaging with you as the performance is going on. Sometimes you could be in a larger setup where there are, say, of course, classical dance form performances don't entertain typically more than a couple of hundreds. I haven't seen, so let's say you're in a performance space where there are a couple of hundred people watching you, which has happened very rarely. But let's say even that. But then there isn't that kind of engagement with the audience that you feel when there are the performance spaces or the number of people are smaller, the more intimate. So every setup is different. In India, again, yes. In India, of course, there is always, they will always, especially in the South, you do find. Also, I found in the North, there are people who will come and talk to you, even in the North. Although they are, I think, because they aren't as exposed to, especially South Indian forms as in the South. Also, not as much cultural performances. Maybe in Delhi, but not in other places. So they are more enthused by it, and they kind of treat it as a novelty or something that is very exotic. And they have a great deal of respect for you. Wherever I have performed abroad, I'll tell you about this interesting experience I had when I was dancing at the Gandhi Center in Hague. I had a bunch of people in the audience who were the indentured laborers who the people from UP Bihar who were shipped to work in Trinidad and Tobago back in the early 19th century. Yeah, so there were a bunch of people from the areas of UP, Bihar, those places where they were sent as indentured laborers to work in the sugar plantations, British, because Trinidad and Tobago was a British colony. So, so I had people from Trinidad and Tobago who had, their ancestors had moved. Basically, their ancestry was Indian. They were native Indians, but they lived in Trinidad and Tobago all their lives and had emigrated to Netherlands. So these people were there in the audience, and I remember doing Ramacharitmanas, which is Anupama's choreography. And I remember it's a beautiful piece which has, Ramacharitmanas is any Indian who is familiar with Ramayana and in Indian traditions would be familiar with Tulsidasa's Ramacharitmanas. And I kid you not, after I finished and I was stepping out and I didn't know anybody there, I had these people come and just completely crowd with a family of about 7-8 people, and one of the gentlemen had tears in his eyes because Ramcharitmanas is written in that boli, na Tulsidas is, I think, Khadi boli or that bhasha, which the kind of Hindi that we don't speak anymore.
Correct.
Yeah. So, hum keht hain, tum sunat ho, that kind of Hindi. And you'd be surprised that those people, they still speak that Hindi.
Oh, wow.
Because time has stood still, right? They're still in that time, or because their parents, their grandparents, everybody would have spoken in that language, and that has remained uncorrupted for them. So they continue to. I mean, in India, we don't speak that language. Even if you go to UP today or Bihar, nobody speaks that language anymore. Right. But these people have continued to. So they were speaking to me in that language, and it was so fascinating to hear them speak in that language. And they were so moved. They said कि हमारा बेटी तुमने तो हमें प्रसन्न कर दिए है. I can't speak that language. So anyway, they were like very happy and moved and emotionally. So you never know whom you are you know, whom you are affecting with your performance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes you have the most interesting of, sort of encounters. So that was one such experience that I had, you know, very
Wow.
unexpected, very
Wow,
touching
that's
moment.
beautiful. Yeah. And I think, like you said, Pujita, you never know whom you're touching through your performance. And, you
Yes,
never know who connects with you and, with whom it resonates. So, for you as a
correct.
dancer, how important is that connection that you form with an audience? Does it really play
Hmm.
an important role in your performance on stage, or are you detached? Does it not matter to you? Or does it vary?
That's a, yeah, that's a very good question. I haven't, I mean, honestly, I'm not, I think through the performance, I have different phases. I can't say that I am
Mm.
the same every performance, or that I am the sort of a person who needs to connect, or I am not, who needs to be detached. I will say that every performance is different, and
Correct.
during the course of the performance, I could go through these transformations. Like, for instance, if
Wow,
I'm
that's
doing,
so interesting.
yeah,
Hmm.
like for instance, if I'm doing nritta, then I'm focused on my dance because I have to think about the variations and what am I doing next, and you know, how many repetitions of this do I do, etc.,
Yeah,
etc.,
yeah,
etc.
correct,
But
correct.
when I'm doing maybe say abhinaya, then I
Hmm.
think I'm more connected to the audience because you it is of course when you're doing abhinaya it's more the pace is slower, and you have the time to also kind of find that rapport with the audience because
Yes.
you can kind of make out how they're receiving it. Because
Hmm.
abhinaya is something, if people are not receiving it, then you're not making that connection because abhinaya
Correct.
is about the communication. So
Yes.
definitely, if say I'm doing a padam, I will definitely kind of sense the pulse of what's happening among the people. You can
Hmm.
sense when you're doing a padam because you're seated, you're not moving, and then you
Yeah.
can tell from the corner of your eyes, you know, are they smiling when you're probably doing a piece or a part in the piece where it's supposed to be funny? Are they smiling? Do they understand it? You know, that is important to me because I would then know whether I'm able to reach out to them and able to communicate to them effectively or not. So yeah, um,
Yeah, that's
that
such an
so I would
honest
say that
answer. That's such an honest response
yeah,
that you've given, Pujita, that there is no fixed rule. There's no hard and fast emotion that you feel as a
yes,
dancer. It varies. It depends. But is
yes.
there any one performance that comes to your mind when you would have felt like an out of body experience, or it just gave you goosebumps, or it even gives you goosebumps even today when you think of it? Do you have any such memory of a performance?
Honestly, Amy, I don't know because I don't, and I think I mentioned this the other day in another talk that I'm a person who is very self-critical and
Hmm.
I also very self-effacing to my detriment sometimes because I end up sort of even dismissing my achievements sometimes, which is probably not a good thing. But I'm the sort of person who will, if someone walks up to me and pays me a compliment, I'll say, no, you're not serious, no, I mean, I can do this better, I could have done that better, or so I'm painfully aware of the flaws in whatever I do, painfully aware. Which is why, because I think for myself, I set the bar very high.
Hi.
Um, yeah, I set it very, very high. In everything that I do, it's not just dance.
Yeah.
Even with writing, I will never be happy with because my inspirations have been people who are of a certain kind. So for me, I'll never be happy with, oh God, I killed it today. Fabulous, man.
Yeah.
I just nailed it. I was so bloody good. I've never had that feeling. I've never had that feeling. Now, I don't know where that leaves me, but I've always felt that, you know what, I have a long way to go.
That is
Having said
amazing.
that, yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
That is amazing, Pujita. And I think that is one of the many things that I love about you as a person. As a person.
Thank you.
dance, writing and education that you're involved in, all that apart, as a person. And this is something I can say out of experience, because I met you when I was 14 years old. And actually, I was going to get into this later in the conversation, but now that you said this, I want to bring it up now. So I was 14
Yes.
years old, and I remember so vividly. I was in Anuaka's house, and we were in the middle of a rehearsal, and the door rang, and the door opened, and I'm not kidding, I sensed this energy just enter the room. And
How
then
sweet.
I saw you move to the other room, and you were, I think, in your gym wear or something, and you went in, you changed, and you came, and that was it. That was that first impression I had of you. And it was such a good impression, because you sense vibes, vibrations from people. I truly believe in it. And the vibrations and energies I sensed with you was something that I really connected with, and I loved. And the second thing I must say, so I came from a background wherein it was a very hardcore class of Kuchipudi, very strict and all of that. And then I came to Anuaka's class. And with Anuaka, it's a lot more than just dancing. You learn so much through
Yes.
conversation. And I remember, we were having our snacks and all of that. And I'm thinking to myself, I really want to have another samosa, but I can't be myself here. I need to be very proper. I can't be myself here. I don't know anybody.
Yeah.
They're also senior. And I remember this, I don't know if you remember, you're like, I'm going to have another samosa. And you were just being yourself unabashedly, which was so rare. Even back then, it was so rare. Now, don't even talk about it. So I think, and that hasn't changed. I was like, should I call you Akka? You were like, no, call me Pujita. You treated me the same way you treated everybody else who were a lot more older than me. And I think that quality is something which is so rare, and it's so amazing, and it's so inspiring. I'm sorry, I was gonna save this to the end, but I just thought,
thank you.
Let me just
that is very sweet.
And this has nothing to do with the fact that you also are Anuaka student, or I've known you for so long. It has nothing to do with that. It is just a genuine connection that I felt with you, and I still feel for you. So thank you for just being who you are.
Thank you.
Yeah. So now, Pujita, I will ask you a question related to your master's in English literature and your PG diploma in environment. So was that something that was planned in your life? Did you always want to do that, or was that something that you developed while growing up? An interest towards
So Amy, here's the thing. I have literally never planned anything in my life.
Wow.
I have always responded to stimuli whenever and wherever it has happened. Also, luckily for me, I have to say, I grew up in a time, also in an environment which afforded that to me, in the sense that thankfully I didn't have to worry about the future, or my parents never put that pressure on me. You have to think of like a professional. I guess they also kind of knew the kind of person I was. I was a very dreamy kid, very, very dreamy kid. I was always in my own world, and, so they kind of, let me be. And I always had the wildest of, at one point I wanted to be a gypsy, although how you can be a gypsy, I don't know. And at one point I wanted to be a farmer. Then I wanted to, crazy stuff. And they encouraged all that, said, yeah, sure, go ahead, do what you want to do. So I have never planned anything. I lived the most amazing life of freedom, but I also came from a culture of, I have to say, a family who is deeply spiritual, also, culturally inclined, at the same time very cosmopolitan. I don't see that. I don't see that combination very rarely. Even I don't see it at all. So therefore, I was allowed to do what I wanted to do. So I never ever planned that this is what I want to do. I always responded to what I felt. Like I said, I read a book and I felt, you know what, I want to be a dancer. And I pursued that to the hilt. I've always been fond of reading, as I grew up in a household which values literature, which values, the habit of reading. So I always grew up reading. And at some point, I think I felt I must pursue this. And my mom said, you know what, why don't you just do your MA in English literature? I said, okay, why not? So I said, okay, I'll do it. So it was never planned. It was never planned. It was just some, stuff that came my way, and I took it up because I liked it. There were other things which came my way too, but I remember when I was 18 or 16, I had participated in a beauty pageant. So, Country Club, Miss Country Club used to be this huge beauty pageant back in the day. And I was 16, and there was a newspaper ad. I was in class 11, I still remember. There was a newspaper ad, and my mother jokingly said, "No participate chestava." I mean, she meant it as a joke. And I said, okay, and I did. And I was the youngest participant, and it was different. This was 94, so you must understand this was a good 27, 28 years ago. So it was very different. And I remember the gown that I wore on my final day. We had to go to Jane Street to get it stitched, and we got it embroidered, and crazy times. And I remember, and I remember meeting Meher Jasia, Arjun Rampal, and all these people had come down from Mumbai. So basically, to tell you that it was always responding to stimuli. After that, there was a lot of I had a lot of modeling offers, I had a lot of television offers, which I refused. Yeah. So it was not as if I did everything that came my way indiscriminately. I always knew what it is that I wanted, what I didn't want. You see? So yeah, so I never planned. I always responded to the stimuli that came my way. Yes.
Right. I understand that. Pujita, you have been teaching at HPS, and I remember that you were also teaching earlier, I think in the 2000s, or if I remember correctly, or the 90s.
2001.
And now you're teaching again. So as a teacher and an educator, over the years, how has your teaching methodology kind of changed? Because people have obviously, kids these days are very different from how they were back then. So have you kind of made a conscious effort to change the way you approach your students, or is that something that you have a standard protocol that you follow when you are in the education system? How is it? I'm curious to know how you think as a teacher.
I have to say it is a very trial and error sort of approach. When I was, but I have to say, my very first job, Amy, was I was 21. I had just come back from Delhi, right? I was there in Shri Ram Bhattic, and I had come back. And my parents were, I guess I said they always allowed me to do everything I wanted, but they weren't very particularly happy that I was, pursuing dance, which they weren't quite sure where it was going to go. So my first job, because I wanted to be independent, was to tutor this kid. This parent, I don't know how I came upon this. They met me and they said, we have this child who's a student. He was a student of HPS at the time. This was in 2001, I think, and class 7. And he says, they said that, we are not able to handle him. Can you just teach him,
Okay.
And I said, what do you want me to teach him? Then they said, everything, whatever you can teach him. And I remember going to his house, and that was a disaster, because I was young, I had no patience, and this kid was a handful, and I remember losing my temper, and losing my patience, and just losing it, repeatedly. After about a month or two, I kind of told the parents, and they themselves realized it was not working out. So then when I realized that, it has to be, you have to kind of figure out a way with dealing with, especially teenagers and especially middle schoolers. And consequently, I joined HPS in 2001. And I was not, of course, since I was only 21, 22, I only taught the middle schoolers. I taught 6, 7, and 8. I winged it then. I completely winged it because I was so young myself. And I realized that you can plan 101 things, but teaching is such a spontaneous and such a every day, every hour, every class is different with the same set of students. So, so you can't, you can plan all you want, but, ultimately it is that moment that counts. So I didn't really I think I just went with my gut feeling, which I still go with even today. And basically, you know, responding. If you're a good communicator, Amy, if you're a good communicator, and you're basically your heart is in the right place, and you want the best for the other person, for the child, I think you'll find a way. For you, it could be, you know, one way. For another teacher, it could be another way.
Another way,
I don't think there is any modus operandi to this. There is no, you know, there is no set path. You have to figure it out with each set of students. Back then, yes, I will say that, of course, since I was only teaching middle schoolers, I got a lot of love. I did a lot of things on the spur of the moment. It was possible in 2001. Things have changed a lot today.
Yes.
Even schools as a system have changed. So I'll just, you know, recount an anecdote. How spontaneous it was back then. So I remember I told a bunch, like my kids, and I was a class teacher of, I remember it was 6F, I think. I was a class teacher of 6F. Okay. And I said, you know what, guys, let's do a picnic. And they were like, yes, ma'am, let's do a picnic. And it was a class of 40 kids. And I could do that back then. I could take the initiative as an individual, which had nothing to do with the school. This was a picnic that I was organizing in my personal capacity as Pujita, not as a teacher of HPS. And I remember I took them to this beautiful, there's a temple here, it's a Shiva temple in the cantonment area, which has a huge, you know, like a wilderness, it's surrounded by wilderness. We had students, so I had a student whose dad was in the army. He organized a 1-tonner for us, or 2-ton, I don't remember what it was, a huge army truck. And it was a Sunday, the kids came to Secunderabad Club, we piled into the truck, and we had loads of fun. And we, you know, we went to this place, and I told them that, you know, ma'am, can I get this, can I get that? I said, you can get all the goodies you want. You can get all your frisbees, you can get your, you know, badminton rackets, your whatever, and get what you want. And I said, but I also want you to write, if each one of you write a piece of poetry, like write some verses. I want you to read out your verses. And we did that. Someone wrote a story, someone wrote a poem. And those kids still remember. I'm in touch with 2-3 of them from that batch, 2001. They're 31-year-olds now.
Amazing.
I can't do that today. I can't do that today.
Pujita, when you say you can't do that today, do you think it's primarily because kids are not kids anymore? They've kind of changed because of circumstances, because of peer pressure, or is it the education system that's different? When you say you can't do it today, why do you say that?
I don't think it's the children, Amy, because children are children at the end of the day. I have to say, again, I mean, just to give you perspective, there are some changes, definitely. Like, for example, before I taught in HPS, or I've been teaching there, I briefly taught in, you know, this place, Srinidhi International School, which works on the whole international curriculum, you know, IB and all of that. So they follow a very American mode of education. Which has become very popular today in our, you know, in across India. When we were growing up, there was no IB. There was no, you know, there was only CBSE, SSC, and you know, ICSE. So now this whole IB business has started. It has its finer points, but I was very taken aback, shocked, surprised, also dismayed by what I saw as a culture there, which was that it was a very American system where students were much more very independent, which is a good thing, but independent to the degree that I felt that some of the good old Indian values of the Indian education system were being lost. Like, you know, they wouldn't wish you while you walk past them. There was no sense of, she's my teacher, you know, like today, or we've grown through that process of, you may be in awe of your teacher, you may maybe not like her, you may like her, you may love her, but she or he is always your teacher. You know, Indian system of the guru is a guru at the end of the day, whether you like them or you don't like them, they are a guru, right? They are imparting education. So when I was in the school, I felt that was missing. I felt that the students just didn't have that connection or rapport with the teachers anymore at all. I kind of felt that maybe that is what is happening in all the schools. But good news is, when I came to HPS, I found that thankfully that was probably the case only with these fancy IB international schools.
Right.
Your ICSC, CBSC, thankfully still run pretty much on the same old, dyed in the wool old patterns. Which was good, because in HPS you do have students, wishing you when you pass by them, and they have that same reverence and respect and love and all of that. So children have not changed, Amy. Children are the same. Maybe they grow up a little faster. Definitely they do. They do tend to, because of the influences and things like that. Yes, I will not disagree there. But like, I teach middle school and I teach high school. I have to say that my middle schoolers are still like the way they used to be back in 2001. Still the same love, still the same excitement, still the same innocence. So it's all in our hands as to how you shape them, right? What kind of influences you give them. So I don't think the children, but the system definitely has, because it is more formalized now. It is stricter. It is more straitjacketed. It is. It's not the system. I'm talking about the management, the teachers, the community of, the management side or the school side, not the students. I feel it is more formalized. It doesn't allow for the kind of spontaneity I had or I could afford back in 2001. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, that was a long answer, but I thought I needed to give you a full
I think that was also a very interesting perspective that you brought out here, because I think as educators, like you mentioned, it's such an important role. It's such a huge responsibility that you have when you're influencing so many students. And when these students realize that you're a lot more than their regular English teacher, and you're like a public figure, and you have this parallel life going on the side now, thanks to social media, nothing is really hidden. So how do they react? How do you react to their the way they ask you questions, and I'm sure they stalk you on social media? So how do you react towards that?
So I mean, yes, it is a different world today, because it is so easy to locate a person. I mean, even if you want to live in anonymity, you can't, because you're out there. I mean, and not that I'm some celebrity with like thousands of followers or anything, but it is easy to locate one today online. So yes, kids quickly found out that I do have a parallel existence, a parallel life, and a parallel identity. So it wasn't, I mean, a bunch of kids from high school mainly. And some of them found out that I had written a book. So despite my wild protestations that please, it is not for 17-year-olds, it is 18 and above. But they were like, ma'am, you know what, we watch Game of Thrones, we watch everything on Netflix. So really, I mean, are you telling us how bad can it be? I said, well, certainly not as bad as Game of Thrones. Yeah, please go ahead and read it.
Exactly.
So, so I mean, it is every generation surprises you with, and you know what the interesting thing, Amy, is that on the one hand, you have this, you have these set of kids who are so vastly aware of so many different things. That's, of course, it's a much more aware world and a much more aware generation. And there are some good things, good aspects of that too, as I discovered pleasantly, because like the other day, and interesting, the things that I enjoy most about teaching, especially high schoolers, is when I have them present their compositions, or when they have them do their oral presentations. So they have a wide range of topics to choose from. And it's interesting to know what topics they speak on, and their perspectives, their insights into those, those issues or those topics. It is so revealing, because you think that really this kid thinks so deeply, does he have that kind of a depth in this, this guy is capable of that depth. Like recently I had a kid talking about his takeaways from the Bhagavad Gita, and I was so happy. He spoke for 3 minutes about, this is a 16-year-old boy who is otherwise he's a programmer, he's into coding, and he's into all that digital stuff. And then he talks about, he's a photographer. He talks about how the Bhagavad Gita has influenced him. And he brought out instances, and he brought out aspects of it and connected it to his life. I was blown away. I was like, really, this is so heartwarming, So all is not lost. All is not lost. I think there is a bright side to it as well. I think kids are as precocious as they may be. They also have, some of them are very smart and have a head above their shoulders.
Yes, yes. That's amazing. That's amazing, Pujita. And the fact that they inspire their teachers, and that's great. And I think it's such a wonderful give and take relationship that teachers and students share. And you're so lucky to have such wonderful students with you. Pujita, a question about your experience in the University of California. You went there to do your master's in fine arts, and you had, I'm sure, a wonderful, I'm guessing it was a good experience, and you would have learned a lot. So were there some similarities or differences which are very evident as compared to your training in Indian classical dancing and your training in Western dancing? So could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yes. Let me talk about the similarities first. Similarities in terms of the artistic community, I've realized wherever it is it's kind of just as just as they have the same concerns as we have over here. Like, for example, they aren't as well off as the artistic community or the dancers community over here. They have the same difficulties in getting performance spaces, getting the same, appreciation, the same kind of, like I remember having these conversations with my friends, my peers there, about how people, when they tell others that, look, I'm a dancer, there's always a kind of dancer, like, how do you make a living out of that? Or how is that a full-time thing?
Is it really the same case abroad as well in the US? Because we somehow believe that it's better for them, and it's somehow easier for them. It's just difficult for us. But are you telling me that it's the same situation for people?
I'm definitely. See, certain things are easier for them just because of the perks of being in a wealthy country. I mean, the country is wealthy, so there are their lifestyle, of course, the average lifestyle of a person would definitely be much more better and more enhanced and more convenient and all of that. They have conveniences that the system provides them that, of course, as an Indian you wouldn't have. So you can't really bring that into the discussion. But barring that, I'm talking about the struggles in terms of within their system. It is not easy for a dancer a dancer will have to have an alternative mode of employment, will have to have, it's not as easy for them to get work, performance spaces, performance avenues. So I'm saying in some, those struggles are the same. And also the perception of the society, definitely. I mean, yes, it is a much more educated, much more aware. We'd like to think they're aware. Frankly, Amy, I think Indians are far more aware than the average American. But I mean, you'd think that the first world country, so they are far more advanced in a lot of ways. But still, there are people who will look at you askance when you tell them that you are a dancer. Because they often wonder that how can that be like somebody's full-time, or even like, oh, you're in a university studying dance, like how does that work? Like, what are you studying there? What is there to study in dance? So those kind of questions, they get asked too, like we get asked over here. What is there in dance? What is the big deal? So those kind of struggles they have. Of course, differences would be that the styles are different, their format is different, the technique is different. So the culture, the physical culture is dance is a very physical culture over there. It is all about the body. It is all about being physically fit. It is all about like I said, for want of a better, very very physical oriented culture about dance. It's about body imaging. I knew students, especially in ballet. I knew modern and ballet. I knew kids, students in undergrad who had severe body image issues.
Oh.
And also a lot of surgeries, a lot of injuries, because it's a very demanding form. So that I would say that kind of dictates the other differences also, because in India, it is changing though. I think we are also becoming a very physical culture in dance.
Yes.
But at least for a better part, or at least for what it is, for what it's worth, because we have aspects like Abhinaya, we have Nritya, we have a very sophisticated, layered and a very textured approach to dance, which makes it, which gives it, you could be a 60, you could be a Vaijayanti Mala, at 80, and you could still be dancing. You could be you could be any shape, but if you are connected with your art, you could be dancing. Nobody is going to stop you at 60. Not 60. There in the ballet world of ballet, you stop when you're 30. Your shelf life is pretty much, you're done by the time you're 30, 35.
Yeah.
So those are the differences. It's a very physical culture, and therefore I'm happy that we have inherited a form, or we are inheritors of a form that allows us to continue to dance or engage with dance at different levels, not just at a physical level.
Yes, yes. And just taking from that, Pujita, your production, Swachanda Vallari.
Yes.
I hope I pronounced it right.
Swachanda Vallari.
Swachanda Vallari. Sorry. Yeah. So what inspired you to come up with that? And can you tell us an incident or two that kind of you get good memories of when you think about your journey, when you thought of that production, when you presented it, the feedback you received, posted? What was that journey like? Why did you think of that theme? And just tell us about that.
Wow. Okay. That production took about 1.5 to 2 or more, actually more, from the conception to its execution. Of course, it should have been done. If I had worked on it, in a sustained manner continually, I think I would have been able to do it in a span of about 1.5 years. But the reason it took longer was because, of course, I put it on the back burner for a long time. How I came upon it was, of course, Shakuntala is of course, this feature from our Itihasa. This very interesting creature who is half mortal, half Apsara, and she has her own mind. I mean, and that's the way Kalidas presents it. And so I wanted to, but at the same time, she also comes across as a victim of, a betrayal, or sort of like a victim, in the sense that she does get spurned, and also interestingly, she is one of the few characters. Like, of course, Kunti is an example of an unwed mother, but Shakuntala is a case of, probably the only instance from our mythology where, or our Itihasa, where she is the first of a kind, unwed mother who kind of raises a single mom, so to speak, Right. So she raises Bharata on her own, till he's about a good 7 or 8 years old. So there are a lot of aspects to Shakuntala which, of course, are very fascinating. And I kind of thought that also because of certain instances that were incidents that had happened in my life personally, the journey that I was going through inwardly in my personal life, I wanted to talk about something. I kind of felt that, put a spin on this and create my own narrative. So I didn't want to present Abhigyana Shakuntalam as a play written by Kalidasa, which has been done countless times, I'm sure, even by theatre people. But I wanted to take just the character of Shakuntala And
Okay.
I don't know how it came to me, but it just came to me that it would be nice to have Shakuntala having this conversation with her own inner voice, you know, and her own sort of like an alter ego or conscience or whatever you want to call it. And her on, kind of telling her, and these are conversations that I think is, as people, can you hear me?
Yes, Pujita, I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. So these are like, you know, conversations that we as individuals, as modern day individuals also have, you know, from with ourselves from time to time. You know, we give ourselves those little pep talks. We, you know, look in the mirror and, you know, we say, like, you know, I mean, not, maybe not like, just like verbalize those things, but we are constantly in conversation with our own selves about our own lives.
Yes.
So I said, you know, I thought to myself, it would be interesting to take this vulnerable character like Shakuntala. She's vulnerable. She's very vulnerable, as I think, I don't want to speak for all women, but let us say, you know, how usually the feminine is, which is very, very vulnerable. And I think at our most emotionally weak moments, we do become very vulnerable. We tend to, again, I don't want to speak for a feminist will kill me for this, but I think we tend to become we tend to become very vulnerable. And the vulnerability can be our strength. The vulnerability can be our fatal flaw. It is how you deal with it. So I thought, you know, of course, Kalidas also himself brings in those symbols in his work, like the symbol of the creeper, the Vanajotsna, and there is the bee, and there is the. But I'd like to think that maybe it was my, if I may indulge a little bit, like my own originality, that I felt that, you know, why not connect these symbols? You know, the idea of the feminine being the creeper, which of course exists in our literary, as it is. I mean, these are traditional literary symbols, but I wanted to play on that. Shakuntala as the creeper, as the feminine, which you know, creeps or finds itself dependent on the tree, and the tree is the masculine, right? Unmoving, obstinate, right? Yeah, frustratingly obdurate sometimes. So, so I'm not pushing any stereotype. This was the idea that I wanted to present.
Yeah.
And the bee is represented by two things, not just the fixture of a tree, but also the bee. The bee.
Yeah.
The male is also the bee that wanders from flower to flower, the bee that is always seeking, right? So these were the kind of like the, you know, I thought, why not spin a story where Shakuntala has this conversation with her own conscience, and the conscience, in the form of an Akashvani, is telling her that, hey, you know, and the story opens with Shakuntala being pregnant. It runs in flashback. So she's pregnant, and she is in the story also. She's pregnant with Bharata when she goes to meet Dushyant. And Dushyant spurns her and says, I don't know who you are, and he in fact calls her names. And he says, I don't know whose child it is. So it's almost like a, you know, he insults her, he humiliates her. So she's wandering in the jungle, and she hears these voices. So cutting along, I mean, you should see the production. Let me not give everything away. So, so anyway, so this is, the idea came to me, and of course, writing it, because the script was completely my own, because I wanted to bring my own skills as a writer, not just as a dancer, but also as a writer into it. And my original thought. So I didn't want to do Abhigyana Shakuntalam as is, but I wanted my original take on it. And so I wrote the whole thing in verse. The whole script is written in verse. And it took me time, Amy, to write it, because it was written in spurts over a period of time. As far as memories of the production, there's so many. It was very, when it finally happened, it happened in a blink, because you know, everything just fell into place. I found the place. The interesting, I think, for me, the most unshakable memory was when it all fell into place on the day that I performed.
Would have been really overwhelming, right?
Yes, it was, because to have moved from an abstraction of a thought, you know, to finally see it being put up live, and the setting was so beautiful. I mean, if I may say so, it was, we chanced upon this particular patch of green in the back. Nobody, I mean, this is in Shilpa Ramam, but right at the back of Shilpa Ramam. And they had turned on the waterfalls just for that particular performance. They were very sweet. Kishan Rao Garu, he was very, very accommodating. And it was like it was like the forest that Shakuntala actually lived in, pretty much like Kanwa's hermitage. So, yeah, I just felt that everything just sort of, came together during that particular production. It was very, very, personally very satisfying.
Yeah, wow. I can't wait to watch it, Pujita. I was very unfortunate for me that I couldn't watch it when you
I know, that's
performed
okay.
it in Hyderabad, but
Yeah.
I really look forward to watching it someday. Question which a lot of people asked me when I posted about your conversation, and the question was about your book, Smitten.
Yes.
So they wanted to know what inspired you to write a novel, and tell us about that whole journey of, finally publishing it and it's out there on the stands. What's the feeling like?
I've always wanted to be a writer. That is, even before I wanted to be a dancer, I always wanted to be a writer. My journey as a writer, I think, began when I was a little girl. I was about 5 or 6 or 7. I don't quite remember. And I remember reading this out to my kids back in 2001. I still have that paper on which I'd written a story called The Parrot and the Thief. So it dates back to the time when I was in, I think, 85 or 86, when I must have been like 7, 8 years old, when I wrote that story. So I've always wanted to be a writer, and that is something that, because my mom used to write in Telugu. She's write short stories. She's a published writer in Telugu. I come from a family of literary figures, so I guess it's there in the I guess it's there in the family. So and like I said, I've been writing on and off since for a very long time. And I started writing my first novel, which never saw the light of day, where I was about 17, and so on. So basically, it started, like I said, very early in life. Mm-hmm. This particular novel, the beginnings of this novel, very interesting, because I consider myself more as a literature person. I'm more into literature, serious literature. Okay. And I have never in my life read a single, work of pulp fiction. I've never. So I never read a Milton Boons. I never read a Jeffrey Archer. I was very snobbish that when I still am, because I'll turn my nose down at anything that is not, literature. So I always, I was working on this, collection of short stories. This was about, I think, in 2006, I think, and I got to know about this this publishing house, which was a startup in Chennai.
Okay.
I got in touch with them, and they liked my writing, and they said, you know what, we are not looking for serious literature, we are looking for chick lit. Chick lit is a genre of literature which was gaining popularity at the time. Okay. Chick lit is like, your Confession of a Shopaholic, women, female based, okay. Easy breezy, light read, and yeah, so that was totally not my thing. I was like, I don't write chick lit, I don't read chick lit, much less write it. And but they said that, you know what, you have a flair, why don't you just send us a chapter, or 1 or 2 chapters, just give it a try and see how it goes, because that's where the market is. Right. So I said, beggars can't be choosers. If I want to write and I want to make a name, then, let me see, let me give it a try. And so I started writing this book. That was the beginning of the journey. And right. I wrote about 3 chapters of it. Of course, it has changed a lot since then. This was in 2007. And I wrote about 3 chapters and I sent it to them, and they liked it. And they said, we see potential, so can you, we're commissioning you and we want you to write this book. Okay. The story of Jayanti, and Jayanti is, a lot of people assume, and that's a problem I have with friends who read your, yeah, which is like, we see you. I said, it's not me. It is not me. Just because I base the character, I mean, there could be shades of me in her, but it's not me. So anyway, I started writing, and they commissioned me to write the book. I signed a contract with them. But the sad part is that I was writing the book. I finished the first draft, and I was back in India after my MFA in the US in 2010. They closed shop. So Fiction Factory, that was the name of the publishing house. They closed shop, and they were like full of, you know, they apologized to me profusely, and I said, all that is very well, but I have this manuscript which is lying in my, you know, I've put work into this, and how do I, you know, how do I make this work? Anyway, so that was how it started. So I basically started writing a book that I was not intellectually invested in, but I did it all the same because I felt like, you know, let me give it a shot. Right. I had that manuscript with me for the longest time. It was in my laptop, it was in my C drive, it was, I put that in my preface. And I remember, I think a couple of years later, I was going through, you know, how you clean your system every now and then. So I was, you know, I was doing that, and I was like, hey, I've written this book, you know, like I've got like 150 pages of this book.
Are you serious?
And I thought,
is that how you stumbled upon it?
Yeah, I was like cleaning. I've got to delete this. This got to go. This got to go. This got to go. And I look at this, and I'm like, 150 pages of, you know, of blood, sweat, and tears, and writing a chick lit that I never wanted to write in the first place. So I thought, you know what? I have put in a lot of effort into this, and let me see if it can be put out there, you know. And I had my cousin is an editor. She was working for Tata McGraw-Hill in Delhi at the time, and and she's a reader. I mean, her great grandfather is like the Tagore of Andhra Lit. He's the Satyanarayana Garu. He's a legend, right? So she comes from a family of literateurs. So I gave it to her, and I said, Padma, I want you to give me your honest opinion. If you think that, if you say delete, all you have to say is DELETE, and I'm pressing delete. Okay. So she called me back, and she said, are you crazy? It has potential, because of course it is not something that you and I would read, but there are readers out there who want to read this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
In that genre of the kind of genre that I was catering to, she said, there is stuff that you won't even believe. There's such bad writing out there. So she says that this could fill that gap, and you should totally. Then she said, of course, there are a lot of changes you'll have to incorporate. You'll have to rewrite it, you know, redraft it, and all of that. And I said, fair enough. I mean, if you think that it has potential, then I'm going to do that. So Amy, I wrote 3 drafts of that book, and. Yeah, 3 drafts. It wasn't easy. I realized writing serious stuff, the stuff that I relate to, is far easier, because that is stuff that I like. But here I was writing for a readership that I didn't understand. You know, it has to be slick. It had to be breezy. It had to be interesting in terms of, you know, love interest, a little bit of smut in it, you know, all of that. So I had to make it without compromising my voice. Correct. So it wasn't an easy job. I thought it was very difficult. One of the most difficult things I had to do. And then I wrote it, and then finally reached a shape where she said, now you can start looking at, you know, putting it out there. And then I started talking to people, and I came upon this publishing house in Mumbai called Become Shakespeare. They basically help people like me, novices, you know, with some, you have to, I mean, it's I would call it semi-vanity publishing. It's not completely vanity publishing, where you kind of, it's assisted publishing. So they, and I was okay with that at that point, because I didn't feel that my literary career hinged on Smitten. So I said, fair enough, whatever gets the book out there, you know. And it worked out with them, and there you go. That's how it happened.
Wow, wow, wow. And Poojitha, you mentioned that you always had a thing for writing, and I think around the time when you were doing your master's in the University of California is when you actually started writing on dance, if I understand correctly, or was it even?
Yes, I started writing.
Was on
Yes.
And then I think there was no stopping you after that. There were a lot of articles that you would, you know, put out there for the world to see on dance. So how
Yes.
did that happen? And then how did you eventually become the dance critic for The Hindu? I mean, you know, that's not something that happens to anybody and everybody. So can you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about, because I see you bringing both your passions and making them one. Your passion for writing
I'm
and
lucky.
your passion for dance.
Yes.
So please tell us about
I consider myself very lucky to be able to do that, to be able to fill that sort of role where I can write as well as, like you said rightly, bring in my love of dance into it. So I started writing on dance, like you rightly pointed out, with my thesis, which was my MFA thesis, which got due to a series of unusual circumstances, it got published by one of the leading academic publishers in the US called ProQuest. They're based out of University of Michigan, and they're like one of the most renowned publishers for academic scholarly stuff. So I was very lucky to get published by them. I never got any royalties. I waived. I mean, I don't think people are dying to buy them. Well, whatever. You know how it is with academic publishing. It doesn't fetch you money, but it's there. Anyway, so I wrote that, and that was a very, very interesting experience because it was dance ethnography, which is basically a field of branch of anthropology, which basically means that you, through your insider privilege as an insider of a particular subculture or a subset of a group of people, you have privy to certain information, and you approach writings, your academic writing from that position, which is being an insider, right? So since I wrote about Vilasi Natyam from that vantage point, that was a very interesting experience. I loved it because I also have a journalistic background, so I love doing investigations. I love talking to people, getting to know their stories and so on and so forth. So that started off, and that gave me a lot of insights. That I enjoyed the process. So that was one thing. Then of course I came back here and I did write other articles, more like all of scholarly nature, for peer-reviewed journals. There are about 3 or 4, then it was, and I write a lot on Facebook for those who know me, and I mean, I keep writing. So I have a friend who actually, she's older than me. She's my sister's classmate, and we were together. She's also a Fauji kid, Pratima. She used to write for The Hindu. She's also a writer. She's an amazing woman herself. She was the dance critic for The Hindu back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And of course, she's a family friend and all that. So she happened to meet me somewhere and she said, would you consider writing, seriously for The Hindu as a critic? And I said that, wow, I mean, that would be lovely.
Yeah.
And, but I said that more than dance criticism, I would love to do, more general pieces on dance also, like, covering different aspects of dance, not just reviewing performances, which is also fine, but my heart lies in writing about dance per se, issues, topics, anything that centers around dance or performing arts. He said, well, once you start writing for The Hindu, and if they find that your writing is on par, and so you never know, you could even get. So how The Hindu works is that they have the Hyderabad offices over here, and when you're writing as a critic, you're writing for the local edition. You're writing for the Hyderabad edition of The Hindu as a dance critic, because you're reviewing for the Hyderabad edition. But they also, when I started writing a couple of articles, they kind of liked what I wrote, and then they said that, and I kind of asked them, can I? Before I got hired, I had to meet with the editor. So it wasn't as if Pratima just wove her magic wand and I became So so I had to be interviewed. I had a meeting with the editor, the chief editor, Mukund Padmanabhan, who's now retired, but he was the chief editor at the time. He had come down from Chennai, and we had a meeting in the offices. And it was a very, again, a little bit, I was a little nervous because, again, this is a chief editor of The Hindu. It's not just any Tom, Dick or Harry. So, yeah. So there were a couple of questions, like he asked me about, you know, my background in dance. He asked me about what I like to read and why I like the authors I read, and you know, so it was not, yeah, it was a little nerve wracking.
Right.
But he was very sweet. And then he said, fine. I mean, why don't you just send me a test article? Let's do a test article.
Okay.
And if I like it, then you're on. So I did that, and he liked it, and here I am.
Wow.
So that was that. And then once I started writing, I said, you know what, I would like to write for the National, because the Hyderabad edition only allows you to, as a dance critic, to only do reviews. It doesn't have space. It doesn't have the space to give for you to write more general articles on dance. Okay. So the editor here suggested that I get in touch with the team, the editorial team in Chennai, and ask them if I could offer, to write more general articles on dance for the National edition, which is a big deal. So I did approach them, and I said that, hey, these are I would want to start off writing on this. And they said, why don't you send it? Let us see if it works. And I did. I think my first article was for the National edition was on Nowhere, George Nowhere, for the World Dance Day. Like, why World Dance Day is called the World Dance Day, and it's recognized by the UN. Not UNICEF. What is the other body? The UN. Yeah, the UN. Yeah, UNESCO. Right? It's recognized as the World Dance Day by the UNESCO. So I wrote a whole article about that. That was my first piece for the National edition. So that's how it. I mean, that's how it took off. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you.
So there you go.
Yeah, nice. Pujita, this question is just popping in my head right now. I'm curious. Do dance critics get criticized?
A good question. I don't know. I will tell you the story though without revealing the identity of the person. I don't think there's a forum, a formal forum for dance critics to be criticized. Like, I don't think there's a parallel magazine that critiques the dance critiques or anything.
Right.
But people will express their shall we say, disapproval or dislike or their unhappiness, displeasure with what you may have written about their performance. And this has happened to me on one occasion where I got a call from a gentleman claiming to be a well-wisher, saying, that citing lines from the article I had written, criticizing or critiquing, not criticizing, but critiquing a performance of this very well-known dancer. Yeah. And I said, sir, and I was very polite. I said, sir, you have every right to your opinion, because these are very subjective things. He said he questioned my conclusions or my observations or the what I had written about the performance, about the music particularly, or about some reservations he had about certain things I had said. So I said that this is a highly subjective field. I am not saying that what I say is the absolute gospel truth. I am not saying that this is written in stone and that anybody who reads this will then have to go by, what I say about this particular person's abilities. Correct. You are welcome to your opinion.
Yeah.
But as a dance critic, the Hindu has, for whatever reason, may seem obnoxious to you, but the Hindu has invested me with this job of writing pieces or critiquing, not criticizing, but critiquing performances. And as a person who's playing that role in that capacity, I will do my job to the best of my ability, as I deem fit. And I don't have any personal vendetta or I'm not taking out, and for that you'll have to take my word for it. I'm not here to prove any point to anybody. But if I am not calling out things for what they are, then I'm not doing my job. If I'm only going to be pandering to the community, because I'm also a dancer, I also happen to be. The other thing is that I wanted to mention here is that when I was writing, when I took on the role of writing as a critic for the Hindu, I did tell them, and I said that, look, I know I'm a dancer, and so there could be a conflict of interest, and people could even wonder about it. So I'm not going to write on Kuchipudi. I'm not going to write on Vilasi Natyam. I think only on one case where I made an exception, one because there was different reasons for which I had to. But other than that, I have only written about other dance forms because I didn't want there to be any conflict of interest, and I didn't want it for me to feel constrained in any way when I'm writing about a peer or a colleague or somebody who I know from my. So this gentleman had issues with me, and I had to gently, not gently, but firmly, yet politely express to him and explain to him that I was doing my job, and he's welcome to disagree with me.
Right. Pujita, that is another trait of yours that I was always in awe of. You have always been a very open person, according to me. Like what you feel is out there. There is like I remember tagging you in a post on Instagram. You had to post a black and white photo, and the status or the caption was, I thrive on blacks and whites, grays be damned. And I think in real life also, you're quite black or white. There is no gray area, I feel. So we always this way?
Actually, no. Actually, I will have to contradict you here. Okay. When I say grays be damned, I mean in terms of expressing myself. When I'm saying something, I don't want to mince my words.
Correct.
I don't want to hum and haw. I don't want to beat around the bush. And I don't like ambiguities when it comes to communication. Tell me like it is, and I will tell you like it is. I'm not going to beat around the bush. Having said that, that doesn't mean that you need to be brutally honest every time. There are times when you need to be gentle with the person. You can't go to someone and say, as a critic or even as an audience, let us say as a dancer, I can't say, I thought it was terrible. I thought your dance was horrible. No, you can't do that because I want to be honest. I'm not going to go around telling people exactly. I mean, you can't have verbal diarrhea. But I'm saying in most instances, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to, the critical things in life, you have to, about your beliefs, about things you hold fast to in terms of your value systems, things which are the cornerstones of your life, of your very being. I think there can be no ambiguity there. You can't be a fence sitter, and I have problem with fence sitters. I have problems with people who cannot stay. And I know, I mean, my people who are close to me tell me that not everybody has the courage to stand up for what they believe in. And I understand that. But I think that at some point in life, you have to have, if you're not expressing it, that's fine. But at least inside, within you, there should be a clarity of thought. You can't say that, abhi ye convenient hai, so I am with A now. Tomorrow that is convenient, so I'll be with B then. Then suddenly I'll be with C. Because it is convenient for you, you know. I have a problem with that. I've always had a problem with. I was always like this, ever. I mean, I don't remember a time when I was not like this.
Wow. And I think that's very rare. You don't really see too much of this, which is fantastic, Pujita. But now coming to a little lighter question.
Yes.
So you're a dancer, you're an educator, you're a choreographer, you're a writer. Which role gives you the most satisfaction, and which role comes to you like naturally?
Okay, that's there are two different things here, which I enjoy more and which comes to me naturally. Two different things.
Okay.
Which I enjoy more, I have to say that I enjoy everything in its given place and given, again, everything has its place in my life.
Right.
I was asked this recently, and I told them that I am not one of those people who I should be. There are times when I tell myself that, you know what, if you were just a little bit more pushy, if you were just a little bit more self-driven, a little bit more self-obsessed, more of a go-getter, I have achieved a lot in my life. It's not that I haven't. I'm grateful for it, but I could have been somewhere else also.
Right.
I know that, given the what I have, the abilities that I do. So having said that, but I'm the sort of person who, again, uh, I do not want to be untrue to myself. At any given point of time, for me, what is most important is to be truthful to myself. If it is not coming from the deepest inner being, from it is not springing from a deep place for me, then I should have the honesty to say that it's not for me, or I'm not enjoying it, or I don't like it. So there are times when I don't, like I was saying, there are times when I don't like to dance. I don't want to practice. I don't want to do anything. I just don't want to. It could be a week could go by and I just don't want to do it. And I give myself that space. I give myself that break. I give myself that sort of, I'm kind to myself and I say, it's okay. Even if there are some guilt fans, it's okay. It's okay. You don't want to do it, don't do it.
Yeah.
So it's like that. And when it comes to dance, what do I enjoy most? So I have this strange, and I can't tell you, it's such a stress buster.
Mm-hmm.
Like I did it yesterday. I'll turn the music on, I'll turn off the lights, I'll keep one light on, I'll draw all the curtains, and I thankfully have a large living room. Yeah. And I just dance to my favorite numbers like I used to when I was 16.
Wow.
And I love that. I just love that. I don't give a, there was a time when I used to dance where I didn't give a damn about who was looking. I didn't give a damn about who thought. I was always the first one to land on the floor. People would, I had a reputation because, so back in the day when we used to have these dance parties, the custom was that you couldn't dance as a stag or as a single. You couldn't dance alone on the floor, even as a woman. You had to be asked. Yeah, you had to have a partner to be on the floor. So I would be waiting impatiently, like waiting for someone to ask me. And the first poor unsuspecting chap who came by and asked me would be like, and all my friends would be laughing because he had no clue what he was in for, because he would take me to the floor and I would abandon him over there and I would take off on my own. I only needed him to have access to the floor, and I didn't give a damn, So poor clueless fellow, he would be like, wondering where I went, and then I'd be like chakkering, taking a chakkar around the floor. So I had a reputation for that, and anyway, so that was just a little anecdote I wanted to tell you. So so when I do that at home, to me that is like like I'm going back in time to the time where I was 16, I was 17, I didn't have a care in the world. And I enjoyed that the most, and even now when I do it, I just, it's like, so that I enjoy that. What comes most naturally to me, I think writing comes very naturally to me. It's my, yeah, of course, there are days when I have writer's block also. There are days when I just don't want to write also. But I think the thing that comes most naturally to me is writing. Sometimes when I start writing, it just goes. Right. So yeah, I think I would say writing and expressing myself. I mean, I've also done a couple of short films, and I discovered that I have an ability to emote, and even that comes very naturally to me. I think if you're a person who is emotional, who has a high emotional quotient, you can. I think artists need to have, and probably do have, a high emotional quotient, and that is why they are doing what they do.
I agree. Pushita, what would your advice be to youngsters in particular who want to become writers, who want to become dancers, who want to become educators? Because I know for a fact that it's not easy being a teenager in 2020. I feel. I don't think it's easy. It's a lot of pressure, and it's a lot of confusion. I feel. I could be wrong.
No, you're right. I think there's a lot of pressure. There is a lot of pressure because so much of stimuli. There is so much of information coming at you from all directions. Yeah. There is no time to breathe. There is no time to breathe. We as adults fall prey to that. So you can well imagine how it would be for a 16-year-old.
Right.
So I do think there's a lot of pressure, and it is no longer a world that it was when I was 16, because there were days when I remember now, I would have a book in my hand. I wouldn't leave. I wouldn't budge from my bed, unless I had to, until I finished that book, and no phone calls, no WhatsApp, no nothing. You finished that book because you had to, because your life depended on it, So those were the kind of things, a TV was rationed, we watched only certain shows. It was only till I think 16, 17, we started having MTV, and, we were the MTV generation, and that happened much later in life. But for the better part of life, it was without this outside noise, as I call it. I think my advice to the younger lot would be that you need to tune into yourself from time to time. You need to take a break from the world. You need to take a break from yourself. Give the world a break from you. They don't have to see you all the time.
Yeah.
You don't have to, I mean, this is my advice. You take it, don't take it, it's up to you. But everything that you do doesn't have to be out there for public consumption, because then what happens is everything becomes about how does the world view me?
Correct.
As opposed to how do I view myself?
Right. So true.
Right?
So true.
Here's the thing, like the value systems that I grew up with, I remember, now, I mean, we're a family where my sister, I remember, is a very good looking woman, and she had a lot of attention when she was growing up. And my mother would tell her, she was what, 15, 16 or 17. And I remember this one day, my sister was sitting and, she was combing her hair and she was looking in the mirror and she was, how young girls admire themselves. And now it is very common because everybody is with a phone and constantly admiring themselves.
Yes.
And we didn't even have a mirror in our room for the longest time. So she was like looking at, she's going for a party or something and she's looking, and my mother walked in and she said that, cut that out. Cut that out,
Right.
Don't admire yourself.
Yeah.
Leave that for the others.
Yes.
And she said that don't get obsessed with yourself, she always had a problem with us spending too much time in front of the mirror because she felt it bred vanity. It's true. The more you stand in front of the mirror, you gaze at yourself, you're admiring yourself, it breeds vanity. Now you may say, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
Well, several things. You become too obsessed with your physical self. It's good to take pride in how you look and all of that, but to get obsessed with it like the way we are today, and it's not just a problem with teenagers. I see it across the board with people. So,
and sorry to interrupt you, Pujita, but I feel it's so easy for anybody to get sucked into that cycle of self-obsession thanks to social media. And as artists, if you're not a part of that whole number game on social media, then you're just a nobody nowadays. It's become that way.
Yes.
How sad is that?
Yes. Very sad. That is something that I'm fighting with too on a regular basis, because so for me, I'm at a crossroads where I wonder, because I'm not a social media person. I just got on Instagram. In fact, what difficulty I had today to even figure this thing out.
Yes.
So I'm gawky at best with most of the other social media platforms. Facebook, of course, came into our lives way back in 2008. I prefer Facebook because it also helps me engage intellectually, because I can put my thoughts out there. Whereas Instagram and Snap, I don't even know what Snapchat is. I don't know how it works, but Instagram and other such platforms, they're only about it only promotes a certain amount of vanity. Of course, it is a great way to get your work out, like I wrote an article, in fact, in my last article for the Hindu was exactly about this, as to, you know, the virtual, is it the real? You know, how real is the virtual?
Or how, I think that's
Exactly.
what it started.
And of course, there is a lot of advantage in terms of putting your work out there. A lot of people are using it. Like today, we are having this conversation. A lot of people use it for classes. Like Anu, you know, Anu, who's such a brilliant academician. She has been using it as a tool to get her work out, and for students to get to know about what her work, and, you know, just dissemination of information and knowledge. So yes, it has its pluses. But I think the minuses far, didn't we do that? Didn't we find a way to do that back in the day? I mean, are you saying that we were ignoramuses before 2000 or whenever Instagram came around? I think we were far more informed then than we are today. So yes, it is a medium for dissemination of information. But come on, we did it with far more elan, even before the social platforms came about. So I really don't know. I really don't know. I think, and today it has become about your worth is judged on the basis of how many followers you have.
Right.
Today, if they ask you, they don't ask you how many performances you had. They don't ask you what degrees you have. They say, how many followers do you have on Facebook? I'm like, excuse me, I don't know. I don't have followers. Mine is a closed personal profile. So now the thing is, it is a question of personal choice, Amy. It is about what is important to you. Personally, I have realized that I am not that sort of a person. Yes, I am on the medium. I am on the medium because I understand that it would be entirely foolish not to be on it also. But I am not in the game. I am not in the rat race. I know I have 100 followers, I'll have 120. But just because I want to keep increasing my followers, or just because I want to be in the reckoning, I'm not going to put out selfies of myself. I'm not going to put out things which I don't believe in. Things which it's okay for. I'm not judging others. I'm talking about myself. I'm not going to do that just because I have to stay current and I have to stay relevant. I'm not going to do that. I believe that my work, like when I put out Swachhanda Gallery, that was a milestone in my life.
Correct.
The number of people who saw it, the people who came to me and said they loved the thought, and that makes a difference to me. 140 followers, 1,000 followers who never watch, who will never see your performance, or or know anything about your work. How does it matter? It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah. That's amazing, Pujita, and I think that's something that people need to hear. That you can still be successful at what you do, even if you aren't on social media and you're not focusing so much on increasing your followers, because I think that's a misconception youngsters especially have. And when I say youngsters, I mean teenagers, young adults. They believe, like I have seen it in my own class, students believe that if you have an X number of followers, you are good at what you do.
And this is what we need to, as I think, as you as a younger dance educator, as a facilitator, as a dancer, we all have a responsibility in dispelling, in disabusing the young ones of this notion. We have to prevent that from becoming the marker of someone's, and I don't want to use the word success, because success is, what is success? What is success? Success is, what is success? I don't like that word, let us say self-worth, let us say, have you been able to do the things that you wanted to do to the extent that you wanted to do them? That is, again, for want of a better word, success. Success is not how many programs you've done in a year, in your lifetime. Success is not how much money you have in your bank. Success is not about how many students you have. I have stopped teaching dance. I have stopped teaching dance because I want to dedicate myself to doing more dance research. I want to do more choreography. I want to do more of the creative part of dance, which is what got me into this in the first place. So to be able to take those decisions, which may seem like you're acting your own feet, but to be able to take them because you feel from within that you need to take them. So I think we need to put ourselves in positions where we can take those decisions without fearing reprisals. I think if we become an extremely scared as people who are constantly worried about how am I going to be perceived
Yeah.
By others.
Yeah.
Come on, man. We need to get out of that.
That's true. That's so true, Pujita, and that's such a vital point that you've spoken about. And I'm sure people who watch this, even if they don't agree with it, they might actually start thinking about what they're doing.
Yeah. No, I mean, to each his own, Amy. These are my truths. These are my personal.
I think it's a nice thing to think about also. You may not agree with it, but it's nice to think about a different perspective, which makes sense. It's not something that doesn't make sense. So, Pujita, my last question to you is, it's a funny one.
Yes.
So, which element of nature do you relate to the most, and why?
Which element of
nature do you relate to or connect to the most, and why?
Oh, you mean 5 elements? That way?
The Panchabhutas.
What I'm a Scorpio, remember?
You've always been a water baby.
So I'm not a great swimmer or anything. I'm in fact a very awkward and a very gawky swimmer, and I'm scared of depth. But it fascinates me. It fascinates me, and I'm attracted to the idea of water, because water can take any form, can take any shape. It can occupy depth. It can run. You have streams, you have brooks, you have oceans, you have still ponds, you have ditch water. So water occupies everything, and water is a very strong element, very malleable element, and also strong element.
Wow, nice. That's lovely to know, Pujita. So I think I'm pretty much done with my questions. If there's any final parting thoughts that you'd like to share with all of us before we sign off?
I think I've been pretty explanatory in everything that I have said so far. I just feel that I think people need to be. I think people need to be more genuine, more sincere. Not people need to be. That sounds like very judgmental. But I think the quest should be more inward than outward. I think that is what is that I think seems to be the bane of today. And I think it would be nice if all of us every now and then looked within and took that plunge.
Right. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Pujita, for taking the time out and doing this.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry about all the technical glitches. I don't know, like I was telling you, I seem to have an anti-technology demon that sits on my shoulder that's perpetually ensuring that everything technological in my life goes wrong. Good job. Well done. So anyway, okay, so sorry about that, but I think finally you got to see me.
I'm so glad I finally got to see you, because it just adds so much to the things you say,
I know.
Wonderful.
I know.
Seeing you speak,
I know.
This adds another dimension to the whole thing. So thank you so much.
I just also want to say, my vote of thanks, Amy. Thank you for having me on the show and reckoning me as one of your star line of women, several women of substance. Like to be reckoned as a woman of substance, definitely. So thank you, and I'm so touched to hear your memories about me from back in the day. So sweet. Thank you so much. It was nice to hear that. Thank you so much. I wish you all the very best.
It would have been incomplete without you. So thank you for accepting to do this and taking so much time out to actually to answer everything with so much of sincerity and dedication. You weren't just answering because you just wanted to answer. You actually meant everything you said, and you're so passionate about it and so genuine about it. And that, I think, that is the biggest take home for me from this whole conversation. So
Thank you.
more power to you, more performances, more books out there for everybody to read.
Thank you.
And
wish you the same. Wish you the same, Amy. And I hope that this is the beginning of another set of innings for you.
thank you so much.
All the very best.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much to everyone who watched us and they were so patient. I think we have a lot of people who were watching us throughout the conversation.
Yeah,
so thank
sporadically.
you everybody for watching. And
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed the conversation. And I will see you all tomorrow with another wonderful woman of substance. So thank you, everyone. Good
Bye-bye.
night. Bye, Pujita.
Bye-bye. Good night.